Hello everyone, my name is Michael McCann and welcome to part 7 of this Wayward Art Company tutorial on creating a character in Blender 2.77. So in the last part we had just finished the fur and then we went on to finish the eyes, and now we're working on the visible part of the character's skin. So I'll type Shift A and I'll add an image texture. And I'm going to be loading in the texture that I had downloaded from CG Textures at the end of part 6. It was sort of that bumpy, I think it was actually a plastic texture, but it resembled really closely the bumps that were, that are on the end or the surface of an animal's nose. So I think it'll work really well. So I'll just hit Control T to add the mapping and the texture coordinate node, because we'll probably have to do some scaling. And then I'll type Shift A and go to Vector and choose the Bump node. And I want to plug the color into not the distance, but the height. Okay, and then the normal output will go into the normal input on the diffuse shader and also on the glossy shader as well. And obviously that texture is too big, so we'll scale it. So we'll change it from 1 to 10 on the X and the Y. And that looks a little better, but let's actually rotate the sun lamp so that we can see the effect a little better. We'll just have it facing the front of the character's face. Okay. And obviously the bump is a little too strong currently, so we can weaken the value a little bit. But for the most part, the scaling looks good, and it definitely brings a little more realism into the surface of the character's skin with that added texture. So I'll take the strength down to maybe even that's a bit strong. I want to adjust the strength so that it doesn't look too bumpy, but I don't want to get rid of those little fine detailed shadows either. So what I might do is I'll adjust the strength to like 0.25, and then now maybe I'll just add the original texture, or rather mix the two textures together. So I can just hold Alt and drag these two textures together, which creates a mix RGB node. And now I'll set the mix type to multiply and take the factor all the way up, which will only use the dark values from that plastic bumpy texture. So it just adds the shadow detail back in. And maybe I'll take the factor down a little just to lighten it up a little. So now you have the mixture of the shadows from the texture itself and also from the bump detail. So yeah, I think that looks pretty good. Okay, so now let's do the same for the paws. I'm just going to select all of the faces that make up the paws, and then we'll just add them to a new material. Okay, and I'm just holding Alt and clicking on the edge of the loop there to select the loop of faces around, and then using the C key to bring up my face selection tool and selecting the faces in the middle. And I'll add a new material and I'll assign all of those faces, and I'll just call this paws. Okay, so now we need to do the feet as well. Okay, and assign those. And then finally the last foot. I should have, maybe when we were unwrapping, I could have added seams there, and it would have made it a lot easier to select these areas by just, you know, hovering over and pressing L, but that's okay. It's all done, so we can start working on the material for the pulse. And rather than use the texture that I painted, I think I'm just going to make it a little easier and just use a mix RGB node. And that way we can just select a brown color close to the color that we had painted on during the texture painting. And now we can just add the texture, that leather texture that we downloaded from CG Textures. We'll just add it to the Mix RGB node. So I'll type Shift A and add an image texture, and Control T to bring up the mapping and texture coordinate node. And I'll find that leather texture. And so now I'll just plug it into the bottom color input. And the scale again is way too big, so we'll just set it to 10 and 10. Okay, that's a little. We can maybe tweak that later, but let's get the color good first. So we'll set the Mix RGB to multiply and take the factor all the way up. And I really want that detail in the leather to show up a bit more. So maybe we can tweak the color of that texture a little bit. But we may not need to. Let's see what it looks like after we add the bump to the material, because the soft shadows and the fine detail of the bump itself might really, you know, bring that detail out. So we are going to type Shift A and add a glossy shader and mix the two together. Okay, and we'll take the roughness up pretty high to maybe 0.35. And the factor I'm going to set down so that it's mostly diffuse and just a little glossy. And like a 0.027 looks pretty good. And now, just as we did with the nose, we're going to add the bump to that texture as well. And I'm just going to adjust the strength to get a little bit of fine detail. So something pretty low, like 0.114, looks pretty good. Now let's create a new material. And I'm just going to call this one gums/mouth. This will just be all of the things on the inside of the mouth, although the tongue was also part of that nose material. I forgot that we had done that in the last one. So this one should be pretty straightforward, because nothing inside of the mouth is going to get any bump detail at all. Except for the tongue, of course. So we can just select all of the gums and the inside of the mouth, which, if you kept your seams, it should be pretty easy to do. And I'll type Control T to add the texture and coordinates, and then select the character texture. And really all we need to do now is just give it a glossy material. So So I'll type Shift A and go to Shader and choose the glossy shader and mix it with the diffuse shader. And this of course will be just a really simple setup. Like I said before, we'll type Shift A and go to Input and then choose the Fresnel node, and that'll be the mix factor. And while you really won't be able to see it too well now because the mouth is closed and there isn't a lot of light going in, once we do some shape keys later to open up the mouth, you'll see the that the surface of the gums and inside of the mouth are in fact glossy. Actually, I realized that the teeth are going to get the same material, so I'm just going to go ahead and add them to the gums and the mouth material. So I'll just hover over each one and press L to select all of those teeth. And then just assign them. So now we're close to being done with the materials. One thing that we do need to do is on the skin material, which is the majority of the body, we need to add some subsurface scattering. So just type Shift A and go to Shader and choose Subsurface Scattering. And then we'll mix these together by holding Alt and just dragging them together. And you'll need to plug the color into the color input on the subsurface scattering. And these settings aren't really important for this material. What's important is just the mix value. We want to just take it down so that it's mostly diffuse and just a little bit of the subsurface scattering. But you can see what it's doing is it just allows the light as it passes through from behind the model. It shows through some of those thinner areas like the ears, and it just gives it a little more of a realistic skin effect. Maybe we'll take the mix value up to about 0.42. Looks pretty good. So you can see that light coming in from behind the ears, which looks really nice. And the last material will be for the claws, so we'll just create a new material and rename it claws. And I can select them really easily by just hovering over and pressing L. And now I'll assign those to that material. And just like with the pads on the bottom of the paws, rather than using the texture, I'm just going to, well, in this case, I'll just be adding a color to the diffuse material itself. So rather than importing that or using the texture that we painted, we can just change the color here. So I'll just change it to something similar to what it was before, this brown color. And now I'll type Shift A again and add a translucent shader. And I can add that with an add shader to the diffuse. And I also want to change the color of the translucent shader, so I can just drag the color from the diffuse down to the translucent shader, but maybe lighten it up a little bit. And this will allow light to pass through the claws and giving them a little more of a realistic looking effect, similar to what the subsurface scatter did for the skin. But I would also want to make them glossy, so I'll type Shift A and add a glossy shader and mix it with the add shader, and then use the Fresnel node as the mix factor. And I think that that's probably good for the character's materials. I think we're probably ready to start on the skeleton of our character, the bones or the armature. So back in my default view, I can split the window so that I can work in both front orthographic and right orthographic. And if I press N to bring up my options on the right, I'll be able to change the name of the individual bones as I add them. So I'll type Shift A and go to Armature and Single Bone. And currently I can't see this in the right orthographic view. So if I go over to my Properties window and select the Armature Object Data, I can check the box that says X-ray, and now I can see the bones through the mesh. So if I tab into edit mode, I can then hold Control, and this will snap to the grid. And I just want to pull this down and out so that it's basically really easy to select, because this will be the root bone that allows us to just select one bone and move the entire mesh and armature together. So I can just change the name. Currently it's just called bone, but I can rename this here to root bone. Okay, so with the bone selected, I can tab into edit mode and then use Shift D to duplicate it. And I want it to be positioned right about where the hips would be. And I can select the tip of the bone and just pull it up so that it's facing the Z-axis, but I need it to sort of follow along with the curve of the character's back. And let's rename this bone hips. Okay, and now I can extrude this up by pressing E, and I want to bring it up to just about where the sternum would start, or like the just the lower rib cage. And I'll call this spine underscore lower. And now I'll extrude up again, still following that curve of the back, and this will be spine underscore upper. Okay, and now I'll extrude up again, and this will be for the neck. And I want to bring the tip of the bone up into the head, so pretty much in line with the character's lower jaw or chin. Okay, and now I'll extrude up on the Z-axis. I'll lock it so that it's straight, and this bone will be for the head. Okay, and now I'm going to create the shoulder bone. And to do that, I can just simply duplicate the neck, because the neck is parented to the upper spine, which the shoulder should be as well. So I'll just use Shift D to duplicate it and position the end to about where the arm would start. And we're only going to be working on one side of the character's bones at the moment, and then we can mirror the bones over and rename them. So it's very important to put the .L at the end of your character's bones. So this is shoulder .L, and then later we'll mirror it and flip the names. So I'll just extrude this bone down, and this will be the start of the arm. So let's call this arm underscore upper .L, and extrude again, just making sure to line the bones up in both the front and the side view. Okay, and this will be arm underscore lower .L. Okay, now we can extrude down for the hand. call this hand.l. And we can extrude down now and make the fingers. We'll need to disconnect the finger from the bone, which is really easy to do. And the way that you do that is you just extrude to make the start of the finger, and then select that bone, and then hit Alt-P, and just choose Disconnect Bone. And that way it's still parented to the hand, but you can position it anywhere that you want on the mesh to offset it. Okay, and we'll extrude down again so that our character can bend his fingers. Because these hands are more paw-like, they only have one joint. If they were more human, of course, they would have two joints, but I think that this will be good for our character. Okay, and we can just use Shift-D to duplicate that and position it over the other fingers. And this is perhaps the most time-consuming part of rigging a character, is getting the finger bones lined up properly. From the side view, it's pretty easy, but from the front view, because the hand is twisted a little, it can be a little challenging lining them up in the front. But with this character, because there's only 3 fingers, and because there's only 2, or rather 1 joint in each finger, it'll be a little easier for us. So we'll duplicate that again, and we'll just bring it up to create the thumb. Okay, and I'll go into top view by hitting 7 on the numpad. And that helps to rotate it into place a little better. Okay, so I'll just rename this bottom one thumb underscore lower dot L, and this will be thumb underscore upper dot L. Actually, might have that backwards, but you know, however it makes sense to you. Just you want, when you're animating, to be able to determine what bones you're selecting just by name. So okay, almost done renaming these. I know that it's a little frustrating and you might not want to rename all of these bones, but this is actually a pretty important thing to do, because a lot of the times you're working in you know, like the object data panels, where you have this list of bones and you'll need to select them not on the mesh but from you know, a list perhaps. So it's really just easier to know what your bones are called. So take the time to name them properly. Okay, so now we can work on the legs. So we'll select the bone that we labeled hips, and we'll use Shift-D to duplicate it, and then drag the top down so that it's lined up with the knee, and the bottom will be lined up to where the leg meets the body. Then we can select that leg bone and Shift select the hips, and press Control-P and select Keep Offset, which parents the bone to the hips, but it doesn't join them. Okay, so we'll just position this in the right view. And now extrude down again to make the lower leg. Okay, we'll extrude to start the foot. let's just hide that root bone so that we can see what we're doing. Hide, of course, is the H key, so just select that bone and press H. Okay, so we'll relabel this leg underscore upper dot L. This will be leg underscore lower dot L. And we'll call this, I guess the foot will be in two parts. I'm going to call this foot underscore upper dot L. You can call it heel, but again, just like whatever makes sense to you visually. So we'll extrude the foot out again. I'll call this foot underscore upper dot L. Then extrude out for the toe, and again. And we'll use Alt-P to disconnect that bone from the foot. So I can now select these two toes and pull them out. Again, disconnecting doesn't break the parent, it just allows you to move them freely away from the rest of the armature. Okay, so I'll start by relabeling my toes. And then select both of them and duplicate them just like you did with the fingers. And name them accordingly. By the way, I'm doing this in the bottom orthographic view, and I got there by hitting Control 7 on the numpad. 7 is top view, Control 7 is bottom view. Okay, so we're nearly done labeling the toes. And again, I know that that's time consuming, but we won't have to do the other side because we used .L, so we'll be able to use Blender's flip names feature to relabel the other side. But before we do that, let's make a couple more bones. I want to do the tail, of course, and also put a few bones in the ears. So to do that, we can just duplicate the head bone. Okay, position the base of the bone to where the ear meets the head, and then drag the top down to about halfway through the ear, because we'll extrude this again so that the ear can bend in the middle. So I'll call this ear underscore lower dot L and extrude up. And this will be called ear underscore upper dot L. And now we can work on the tail, so we can just duplicate the hips again, and then rotate it into position, and then select the tail, and then shift select the hips, and use Control P, and choose Keep Offset. And now it's parented to the rest of the armature. and we'll just call this bone tail, but we're not going to relabel every bone after this. As you can see, it creates a new one and calls it tail.001, tail.002, and so on. So I think that will probably work well enough rather than relabeling each individual tail bone because there's so many. I think that the names given to them will be fine. That's looking good. You want to use enough bones in there because the tail is going to be you want it to be able to bend at lots of different points. Okay, so I think we're ready to duplicate these bones now to the other side. So that's actually really easy to do. We need to go into wireframe mode so that we make sure that we select everything. So Z to go into wireframe, and then B to box select the whole right side, or in this case it's the character's left side. And you want to make sure that you select all of those bones. The only thing that you don't want selected are the spine, the neck, the head, and the tail bones. But everything else with .L at the end of it you need selected. And then Shift D to duplicate it. And then you want to make sure that your cursor is in the center and that you're pivoting around the 3D cursor. Now go to Armature, Mirror, and select X Local. Okay, so now with all of the bones that you just mirrored over selected, and it's important to make sure that you don't have anything in the center selected, like the root bone or anything in the spine. Then you can come down to Armature and then select Flip Names. And now you can see that all of those .Ls have been replaced with .Rs, which is a huge time saver. It's really great, but you might also notice that some of these bones don't look like they were mirrored properly, so they're rotated a little funny. And there's actually a really easy way to fix it, and it's very important to fix. So let's go over to our options and check X-axis mirror. And now let's just select all of the bones that we had originally before we mirrored over the right side. Okay, and if we just type Control R, it fixes the rotation of those mirrored bones. Okay, so I think that this part is coming to an end, and in the next part we'll work on the weight painting and so on. And we have more to do with the rig too, adding IKs and so forth. But right now I'm going to select this root bone, and over here in my bone options I'm going to uncheck deform, because when we do parent this to the mesh, we don't want that bone to create a vertex group. But all of the other bones will need vertex groups so that they can deform the mesh. But before we add this to the mesh, it's important to make sure that all of your bones are, where you want them to be. And of course, X-axis mirror is still on, so anything that you do to one side, it will do it to the other as well. Okay, and I was going to wait until the next part to parent the bones to the mesh, but I think I'm just going to go ahead and do it now, and that's where we'll leave off. So I'll select the mesh and then shift select the armature and just hit Control P and choose with automatic weights, and we get this error message. It just says that the bone heat weighting failed, and all that means really is that there are maybe double vertices or something that's wrong with the mesh. So the easiest way to fix this is to go over to your modifiers and just get rid of that Subsurface modifier. And now when we try to parent it to the mesh again, it works perfectly fine. Let's just double check to make sure. go down to pose mode, and then rotate the neck. Yeah, okay, so it works fine. And then now we can go back into our modifiers and just add the subsurf again, and everything will work fine. So now if I go back into pose mode, I can select the bones and rotate them, and everything is working. So in the next part, we will do our weight painting, and then of course add some IKs and do some more fun stuff with the armature. But thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.